Melissa Hartford stood in her cramped studio apartment, her hands trembling as she stared at the divorce papers her husband Jake had just thrown on the kitchen counter, his face twisted with disgust as he told her she was too fat to be seen with anymore. But what Jake didn't know was that 3 days ago, Melissa's grandmother had passed away, leaving behind a secret billion-dollar empire that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. An empire Melissa knew nothing about until the lawyer's cryptic voicemail that morning mentioned a $700 million fortune with her name on it. Melissa had always believed she was ordinary, just a plus-size woman working double shifts at a diner to support Jake's entrepreneurial dreams. But now, as Jake packed his designer luggage to move in with her former best friend Victoria, who had spent years whispering poison in his ear about Melissa's weight and worth, something ancient and powerful stirred inside her chest. The lawyer had said her grandmother's empire touched everything from real estate to technology, from fashion to finance. But Melissa hadn't told anyone yet, not even her mother, because the same grandmother who left her this fortune had also left a sealed letter with one instruction: trust no one until you understand why I kept this secret from everyone, including you. But who was Melissa's grandmother really? And why had she lived in a modest suburban home while controlling a billion-dollar empire from the shadows? Why had she chosen Melissa, the granddaughter everyone overlooked, the one Jake called embarrassing at parties, the one Victoria had befriended only to steal her husband? And what would happen when Jake discovered that the woman he just discarded like yesterday's trash was about to become one of the most powerful people in the state, while Victoria, who thought she'd won the prize, was actually clinging to a man who just made the most expensive mistake of his life? Melissa's fingers traced the edge of the divorce papers, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of Jake. The apartment smelled of the cheap vanilla candles she bought in bulk from the dollar store, a scent that had once meant home, but now felt suffocating. Jake stood by the door with his arms crossed, his jaw set in that familiar expression of contempt he'd perfected over the past year. "You're really doing this," Melissa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "After 7 years. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jake replied, checking his watch, an expensive Rolex she'd never seen before. "Victoria's waiting in the car. We have reservations at Marcello's." Marcello's, the Italian restaurant downtown where Melissa had suggested they celebrate their anniversary last month, but Jake had said it was too expensive, that they needed to be realistic about their financial situation. But apparently when Victoria wanted Italian food, money was no object. Melissa felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart breaking, but something else, something that had been holding her together through years of criticism and casual cruelty. "Victoria's been my best friend since high school," Melissa said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "How long has this been going on?" Jake had the decency to look away, but only for a moment. "Does it matter?" "Look at yourself, Melissa. I've tried to be supportive, but you've let yourself go. Victoria takes care of herself. She goes to the gym. She dresses like a woman who respects herself." The words were designed to wound, and they did, but beneath the pain, Melissa felt that strange stirring again, like something waking up after a long sleep. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the third call from the law office of Patterson and Associates. She'd been ignoring it all morning, too devastated by Jake's announcement to deal with anything else. But now she wondered if maybe the universe was trying to tell her something. "Sign the papers," Jake said, sliding them across the counter. "I'm not asking for much. You can keep the apartment lease, the furniture, whatever. I just want this done quickly." How generous, Melissa thought bitterly. He was letting her keep the second-hand couch they'd bought from a thrift store and the apartment she'd been paying for mostly by herself while Jake pursued one failed business venture after another. She picked up the pen he'd left beside the papers, and for a moment she almost signed. The old Melissa, the one who'd spent 7 years trying to be smaller, quieter, less of an inconvenience, wanted to end this humiliation as quickly as possible. But then her phone buzzed again, and this time she pulled it out. The voicemail notification glowed on the screen, and she remembered the lawyer's words from this morning, words that hadn't fully registered through her shock. "Ms. Hartford, this is regarding your grandmother Eleanor Hartford's estate. It's imperative we speak today. There are matters of significant financial importance that require your immediate attention. Significant financial importance. Her grandmother Eleanor had died 3 days ago, peacefully in her sleep at 89. Melissa had been at the funeral yesterday, a small affair at the Methodist church Eleanor had attended for 50 years. Her mother had cried quietly in the front pew. Melissa had held her hand and wondered how she was going to tell her about the divorce. Nobody had mentioned money or estates or anything unusual. Eleanor had lived simply in a ranch-style house in Riverside, volunteering at the library and tending her rose garden. "Are you going to sign or not?" Jake's impatience pulled her back to the present. "Victoria's texting me. We're going to be late." Melissa looked at him. Really looked at him, for the first time in months. When had his face become so unfamiliar? When had the man she'd fallen in love with in college, the one who'd written her poetry and called her beautiful, become this stranger who could barely hide his disgust when he looked at her? She set down the pen. "No," she said quietly. Jake's expression shifted from impatience to disbelief. "What?" "I said no. I'm not signing anything today. I need time to think, to get my own lawyer, to understand what I'm agreeing to." "There's nothing to understand," Jake said, his voice rising. "It's a straightforward divorce. No kids, no property, just a clean break. Don't be difficult about this, Melissa." Don't be difficult. She'd heard that phrase so many times over the years. Don't be difficult about his mother's criticism of her cooking. Don't be difficult about canceling their vacation so he could invest in his friend's cryptocurrency scheme. Don't be difficult about Victoria spending so much time at their apartment, sitting too close to Jake on the couch, laughing at his jokes with her hand on his arm. "Get out," Melissa said, surprised by the strength in her voice. Jake blinked. "What?" "Get out of my apartment. If you want a divorce, you can have your lawyer contact mine. But right now, I want you to leave." For a moment, Jake looked like he might argue, but something in Melissa's expression must have convinced him she meant it. He grabbed his last bag and headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Being stubborn won't change anything. You're still going to be alone in this shitty apartment with nothing and no one. At least if you sign now, you can keep some dignity." "Get out, Jake." He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the cheap frames on the walls. Melissa stood in the sudden silence, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. She picked up her phone and called Patterson and Associates. A crisp female voice answered on the second ring. "Patterson and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "This is Melissa Hartford," she said. "I'm returning Mr. Patterson's call about my grandmother's estate." "Oh, Ms. Hartford, thank goodness. Mr. Patterson has been trying to reach you all morning. Please hold, I'll put you through immediately." The hold music was classical, something soothing with strings. Melissa sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly weak. Through the window, she could see Jake's car pulling away from the curb, Victoria's blonde hair visible in the passenger seat. They were laughing about something. Probably her. Probably how pathetic she'd looked standing there with tears in her eyes, how easy it had been to walk away from her. "Ms. Hartford?" A deep male voice came on the line, urgent and professional. "This is Robert Patterson. Thank you for calling back. I apologize for the persistent attempts to reach you, but your grandmother's estate is a time-sensitive matter." "I don't understand," Melissa said. "My grandmother lived very modestly. She didn't have much." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Melissa heard papers rustling. "Ms. Hartford, I think you should come to my office this afternoon. There are documents you need to see, and this conversation is best had in person. How soon can you be here?" "I have a shift at the diner at 4, Melissa said automatically, then stopped herself. What was she doing? Her husband had just left her for her best friend, and she was worried about her shift at Lou's diner. "Actually, I can come now. Where's your office?" Patterson gave her an address in the financial district downtown, a part of the city Melissa rarely visited. She wrote it down on the back of an envelope, her mind racing. Time-sensitive matter. Documents she needed to see. Significant financial importance. None of it made sense. Eleanor had been a librarian before she retired. She lived on Social Security and a modest pension. She'd clipped coupons and bought her clothes at department store sales. But then Melissa remembered something strange from the funeral. An elegant older man in an expensive suit had stood at the back of the church during the service. He hadn't come to the reception afterward, and when Melissa's mother had asked who he was, nobody seemed to know. He'd placed a single white rose on Eleanor's casket and left without speaking to anyone. Melissa grabbed her purse and keys, catching sight of herself in the mirror by the door. Jake's words echoed in her head. Too fat, let yourself go. Embarrassing. She was wearing her diner uniform, a polyester dress that had seen better days, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman barely holding it together. But as she locked the door and headed down the stairs to her ancient Honda, something her grandmother had told her years ago surfaced in her memory. They'd been in Eleanor's garden, and Melissa had been crying about something, maybe a boy or a mean girl at school. Eleanor had taken her face in her hands, her grip surprisingly strong, and said, "Listen to me, Melissa. The world will try to make you small. It will try to convince you that you don't matter, that you should be grateful for scraps. But you come from strength. You come from women who build empires and burn them down when men tried to take them. Never forget that." At the time, Melissa had thought it was just the kind of thing grandmother said, poetic encouragement without real meaning. But now, driving through the midday traffic toward downtown, she wondered if Eleanor had been trying to tell her something specific, something important that Melissa had been too young or too self-absorbed to understand. The financial district gleamed with glass and steel towers that seemed to touch the clouds. Patterson and Associates occupied the entire 40th floor of one of the most prestigious buildings on Commerce Street. The lobby was all marble and modern art, and the receptionist who greeted Melissa looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Melissa felt acutely aware of her cheap uniform and scuffed flats. "Ms. Hartford," the receptionist said warmly, as if Melissa belonged here. "Mr. Patterson is expecting you. Please follow me." They walked down a hallway lined with photographs of the city skyline, past offices where important-looking people talked on phones and studied computer screens. Robert Patterson's office was at the end of the hall. A corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city Melissa had lived in her whole life but had never seen from this angle. Patterson stood when she entered, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. He came around his desk to shake her hand, his grip firm and respectful. "Ms. Hartford, thank you for coming. Please sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine," Melissa said, sinking into a leather chair that probably cost more than her car. "Mr. Patterson, I don't understand what this is about. My grandmother wasn't wealthy." Patterson returned to his desk and opened a file folder, thick with documents. His expression was serious, almost grave. "Ms. Hartford, your grandmother, Eleanor Hartford, was one of the wealthiest women in this state. At the time of her death, her estate was valued at approximately $1.2 billion. The words hung in the air between them. Melissa heard them, understood them individually, but together they made no sense. $1 billion? Her grandmother Eleanor, who lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house and drove a 15-year-old Buick. "That's impossible," Melissa said. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake." Patterson turned the folder toward her, revealing the first page of what looked like a financial statement. The numbers were staggering. "Your grandmother was the founder and majority shareholder of Hartford Holdings, a private equity firm that owns stakes in over 200 companies across various industries. Real estate development, technology startups, manufacturing, even a chain of boutique hotels. She built this empire over 60 years, starting with a small investment in a struggling factory in 1965. Melissa's hands had gone numb. She stared at the papers without really seeing them. But how? Why didn't anyone know? Why did she live the way she did? "Those are questions only your grandmother could fully answer," Patterson said gently. "But she left you this letter. She instructed me to give it to you before we discussed anything else about the estate." He handed Melissa a cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal. Her name was written across the front in Eleanor's elegant cursive. Melissa's fingers trembled as she broke the seal and pulled out the letter, her grandmother's handwriting filling 3 pages of heavy stationery. "My dearest Melissa," Eleanor's letter began, and Melissa felt tears spring to her eyes at the familiar endearment. "If you're reading this, then I've passed on, and Robert has told you about the empire I've spent my life building and hiding. I imagine you're confused and possibly angry that I kept this from you, from everyone. Let me try to explain." The letter went on to tell a story Melissa had never heard, about a young woman named Eleanor Morrison, who'd grown up poor in the 1940s, who'd watched her mother work herself to death in a textile factory while her father drank away his paycheck every Friday night. Eleanor had been brilliant with numbers, but in those days, women didn't go to business school or work in finance. She'd married young, to a man named William Hartford, and for a few years, she'd tried to be the perfect housewife. But William had been cruel in ways both large and small, Eleanor wrote. He'd controlled every penny, monitored every purchase, used money as a weapon to keep her dependent and afraid. When Eleanor had finally found the courage to leave him, she'd had nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination never to be powerless again. She'd started small, investing money she'd saved from odd jobs in a failing factory that made industrial parts. Everyone told her she was crazy, that she'd lose everything. But Eleanor had seen something others missed. She'd turned that factory around in 2 years, sold it for 10 times what she'd paid, and reinvested the profits. Then she'd done it again and again, building wealth quietly and carefully, always using holding companies and proxies to keep her name out of the public eye. Why the secrecy? Eleanor's letter continued. Because I learned early that being a wealthy woman makes you a target, Melissa. Men want to control you. Family wants to use you. Everyone suddenly has an emergency that only your money can solve. I wanted to live a normal life, to be judged for who I was rather than what I had. I wanted to know that the people who loved me, not my bank account. Melissa read about how Eleanor had met and married Melissa's grandfather Thomas when she was 40, how she'd never told him about the empire because she wanted to build a life based on real partnership, not financial imbalance. Thomas had been a good man, Eleanor wrote, a teacher who'd loved her completely and treated her as an equal. He died 20 years ago, never knowing that his modest librarian wife controlled a business empire worth hundreds of millions. I chose you as my heir for many reasons, Melissa, Eleanor wrote in the final paragraphs. You have my father's gift with numbers and my mother's steel spine, even if you don't know it yet. But more importantly, I've watched you spend your life trying to make yourself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. I've seen you apologize for taking up space, for having opinions, for simply existing in a body the world has told you is wrong. I need you to understand something crucial. There is nothing wrong with you. There never was. The people who made you feel less than are the ones with the problem. This empire is yours now. Use it wisely, trust carefully. Remember that money doesn't make you better than anyone, but it does give you power, and power can be used to help or to harm. I hope you'll use it to build the life you deserve, not the life others think you should have. One last warning. There are people who will discover what you've inherited. Some will want to take it from you. Others will want to use you to access it. In the beginning, trust no one completely. Watch how people treat you when they think you have nothing, because that's who they really are. The sealed file Robert has for you contains the names of people I trusted and people I didn't. Read it carefully. I love you, my darling girl. I'm so proud of the woman you are, and I can't wait to see who you'll become once you understand your own power. All my love, Grandma Eleanor Melissa sat in Patterson's office, tears streaming down her face, the letter trembling in her hands. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, herself had just shifted. Jake's face flashed in her mind, his contemptuous expression as he'd called her too fat, too embarrassing. Victoria's fake sympathy as she'd slowly poisoned Melissa's marriage while pretending to be her friend. They had no idea what they'd just walked away from. Ms. Hartford? Patterson's voice was gentle. I know this is overwhelming. We don't have to discuss everything today. But there are some immediate decisions that need to be made. Hartford Holdings has a board meeting on Friday. They don't know yet that Eleanor has passed or that you're her heir. Your grandmother left specific instructions about how she wanted you to be introduced to the board and the various company executives. Melissa wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. What kind of decisions? Patterson pulled out another folder. Your grandmother had been planning her succession for years. She has people in place she trusted, managers and executives who've been running the day-to-day operations. But as the majority shareholder, you have final say on all major decisions. There's a proposed merger with a tech company that needs your approval, a real estate development project in Miami that's waiting for the green light, and there are personal matters as well. Personal matters? Your grandmother owned the building where you currently live, Patterson said. In fact, she owns 17 properties in that neighborhood. She also owned Lou's Diner, where you work. She's been your landlord and your employer for years, though she arranged it so you'd never know. Melissa felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She owned Lou's Diner? But Lou's been running it for 20 years. Lou Martin was hired by your grandmother in 2005 to manage the diner as a part of a larger neighborhood revitalization project. He's always believed he was working for a holding company. He has no idea Eleanor Hartford was his actual employer. Why? Melissa asked, her voice breaking. Why watch me struggle like that if she could have helped me anytime? She wanted you to develop your own strength, Patterson said quietly. She believed, and I'm quoting from her notes here, that Melissa needs to learn who she is without my money influencing every relationship and decision. When she inherits, she'll know that everything she built before that moment was real and earned. She was planning to tell you everything when you turn 30, which is next month. She just ran out of time. Next month, Melissa would have turned 30 next month, and Eleanor had planned to reveal everything. But instead, Eleanor had died, and Melissa had been going through one of the worst days of her life, getting divorced and humiliated, with no idea that everything was about to change. There's something else you should know, Patterson said, hesitating. Your grandmother had Hartford Holdings research team prepare background reports on certain people in your life. Standard security measures for protecting family members. Jake Thornton and Victoria Chen are both in these files. He pushed another folder across the desk, this one marked with red tabs. Melissa opened it with shaking hands and started reading. The first page was about Jake, and what she found there made her stomach turn. Jake's business ventures had all been funded by loans from Victoria's father. Loans Jake had never mentioned. He'd been borrowing money for years, racking up massive debt, all while telling Melissa they couldn't afford anything. But it was Victoria's file that truly shocked her. Victoria Chen, Melissa's best friend since high school, came from money but had been cut off by her father 2 years ago after some kind of scandal involving embezzlement from the family business. She'd been desperately trying to marry rich ever since, targeting several wealthy men in succession. According to the investigation notes, Victoria had deliberately befriended Melissa in high school because Melissa's tutoring had helped Victoria maintain the grades she needed to stay in her prestigious private school. Everything had been transactional. The entire friendship had been based on what Victoria could get from Melissa. And when Victoria had realized Jake was weak and easily manipulated, she'd seen an opportunity. The notes indicated that Victoria had been systematically undermining Melissa's marriage for 18 months, using Jake's insecurity and ego against him, promising him that if he left Melissa, Victoria's family connections could set him up in business. But Victoria's family had disowned her. She had no connections, no money, nothing to offer Jake except debt and false promises. They were too broke, desperate people who decided Melissa was the problem, standing between them and the success they felt entitled to. Your grandmother noted in her files that she considered intervening several times, Patterson said, but she ultimately decided that you needed to see people's true natures on your own. She believed that if you discovered who Jake and Victoria really were after you inherited, you'd never fully trust your own judgment again. You'd always wonder who was with you for you and who was with you for your money. Melissa looked up from the files, understanding flooding through her. Eleanor had watched her struggle, watched her marriage crumble, watched Victoria slowly poison everything, and she hadn't intervened because she'd wanted Melissa to learn the lesson now, while she still thought of herself as ordinary and powerless. Jake and Victoria had revealed exactly who they were when they thought Melissa had nothing. What do I do now? Melissa asked, feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of everything that had changed in the past hour. Patterson smiled, the first time his serious expression had softened. Whatever you want, Miss Hartford. You're one of the wealthiest women in the state. You have resources most people can't even imagine. Your grandmother left detailed instructions if you want to follow her playbook, but ultimately, this is your empire now. You can maintain her strategy of secrecy, or you can go public. You can continue her investments, or you can sell everything and start fresh. The choice is entirely yours. Melissa thought about Jake and Victoria, laughing in his car as they drove to their expensive dinner, congratulating themselves on escaping from the burden of Melissa. She thought about the divorce papers sitting unsigned on her kitchen counter. She thought about her grandmother, who'd built an empire in secret and lived a modest life by choice, teaching Melissa through silence and patience that real power didn't need to announce itself. "I want to learn everything," Melissa said, her voice stronger now. "Everything about Hartford Holdings, about every company we own, every investment, every asset. I want to understand what my grandmother built and why. And I don't want Jake or Victoria to know anything has changed. Not yet." Patterson nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother would be very pleased to hear that. She left educational materials for you, years of recorded lectures and notes about business, finance, negotiation, everything she thought you'd need to know. She also assigned you a mentor, someone she trusted completely who can guide you through the transition." "Who?" "Thomas Chen, Victoria's father." Melissa's eyes widened in shock. "Victoria's father knows about this?" "He's been on Hartford Holdings board for 15 years. He's one of the few people who knew Eleanor's identity and kept her secret. He's also the one who cut Victoria off when he discovered she'd stolen from the family business. According to your grandmother's notes, Thomas is deeply ashamed of his daughter's behavior and feels responsible for her sense of entitlement. He's committed to making sure Hartford Holdings continues Eleanor's legacy." The irony was almost too much. Victoria's own father, the man she'd been lying about having connections to, was part of Eleanor's inner circle and would now be helping Melissa navigate her new role. If Victoria ever found out, it would destroy her. Melissa stood up, her legs steadier than they'd been when she arrived. "When can I start?" "Right now, if you'd like," Patterson said. "We have conference rooms available. I can start walking you through the basics of the estate, and Thomas can meet us here within the hour. But Ms. Hartford, I should warn you, this is going to be intense. Your grandmother built something remarkable, but managing it requires enormous time and energy. Your life is about to change in ways you can't fully anticipate." "My life already changed," Melissa said, thinking of Jake's contemptuous face, the divorce papers, the moment she decided she was done being small. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." As Patterson made phone calls and gathered documents, Melissa walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, Jake and Victoria were having their celebration dinner, probably toasting to their new life together, completely unaware that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Melissa's reflection stared back at her from the glass, and for the first time in years, she didn't automatically catalog her flaws or apologize for taking up space. She saw her grandmother's eyes looking back at her, fierce and determined. She saw a woman who'd been tested and hadn't broken. She saw someone who was about to learn her own power. The old Melissa, the one who'd spent 7 years trying to shrink herself to fit Jake's expectations, was gone. Something new was emerging, something Eleanor had apparently seen all along, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to wake up. And Jake and Victoria had absolutely no idea what was coming. The conference room where Thomas Chen met Melissa 2 hours later was decorated with the understated elegance that seemed to characterize everything about Hartford Holdings. Thomas was in his mid-60s, tall and distinguished with steel gray hair and eyes that assessed Melissa with sharp intelligence. But when he shook her hand, his expression was kind. "Ms. Hartford, it's an honor to finally meet you properly. Eleanor spoke of you often during our board meetings. She was extraordinarily proud of you." "She never mentioned you," Melissa said, then winced at how rude that sounded. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Don't apologize for honesty," Thomas interrupted gently. "Eleanor kept many secrets, even from those she loved. It was part of how she protected herself and built what she built. Please sit down. Robert tells me you want to learn everything, starting immediately. That's an admirable impulse, but also potentially overwhelming." They spent the next 3 hours going through an overview of Hartford Holdings that made Melissa's head spin. Eleanor's empire was far more complex and far-reaching than she'd initially understood. There were technology investments in companies whose products Melissa used daily without knowing her grandmother owned stake in them. Real estate holdings that included not just the building where Melissa lived, but entire downtown blocks. Manufacturing companies, agricultural operations, a venture capital fund that invested in women-owned startups. Your grandmother had a particular passion for supporting female entrepreneurs, Thomas explained, showing Melissa a portfolio that included over 50 companies. She believed that the best way to change the world was to give women the resources to build their own empires. Many of these women have no idea their primary investor was female. Eleanor insisted on anonymous backing. Melissa thought about all the years she'd struggled, working minimum wage jobs and scraping by, while her grandmother had been literally investing millions in other women's dreams. The contradiction hurt, but she was beginning to understand Eleanor's reasoning. Melissa had needed to develop her own strength, her own sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on money or external validation. "There's something you should know about Victoria," Thomas said quietly, his expression pained. "I failed as a father in many ways. I gave her everything, and in doing so, I taught her that she didn't have to earn anything or value anyone who couldn't benefit her. When I discovered she'd stolen from our family company to fund a gambling habit, I cut her off completely. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I hoped it would force her to develop integrity. Instead, she targeted my husband," Melissa said, the pieces clicking together. "I didn't know about that until Eleanor's investigators brought it to my attention 6 months ago," Thomas said, shame evident in his voice. "By then, the damage was done. Eleanor and I debated whether to tell you, but she insisted that you needed to see Victoria's true nature yourself, without interference. She believed that if she intervened, you'd never fully trust yourself to recognize manipulation in the future." It was a hard lesson, but Melissa was beginning to see the wisdom in it. If Eleanor had simply warned her about Victoria, Melissa might have doubted herself, wondered if she was being paranoid or judgmental. But watching Victoria systematically destroy her marriage while pretending to be her friend had taught Melissa to trust her instincts about people's character. "Jake called me 3 months ago," Thomas continued. "He'd somehow discovered my connection to Victoria and asked me to invest in a business venture, something about cryptocurrency and NFTs. When I declined, he became quite angry, said that as Victoria's father, I owed it to her to help her fiancé succeed." "Her fiancé?" Melissa's voice came out sharper than she intended. "They'd already decided to get married 3 months ago?" "According to Jake, yes. He seemed confident that once he divorced you and married Victoria, her family money would solve all his financial problems." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't disabuse him of that notion. I simply declined to invest and made a note in Hartford Holdings files never to do business with him." Melissa felt the betrayal cut deeper, knowing that Jake and Victoria had been planning this for months, maybe longer. All those times Victoria had come over for girls' nights, listening to Melissa worry about her marriage, offering sympathetic advice while secretly sleeping with Jake. All those times Jake had criticized Melissa's weight, her clothes, her lack of ambition. He'd already been planning to leave her for her supposed best friend. "I know this is painful," Thomas said gently, "but Eleanor believed you were strong enough to handle it. She also believed that once you understood your own power, you'd know exactly how to handle people like Victoria and Jake." "What would she have done?" Melissa asked. Thomas smiled slightly. "Eleanor had a saying, 'Let them think they've won. Let them celebrate. Let them spend their victory before they realize it was built on sand.' She didn't believe in immediate revenge. She believed in letting people destroy themselves through their own greed and short-sightedness." Patterson returned to the conference room with dinner, takeout from an expensive restaurant that made Lou's Diner look like exactly what it was. As they ate, Thomas and Robert walked Melissa through the immediate decisions that needed her attention. The tech company merger could wait a few weeks. The Miami real estate project needed approval by the end of the month. And there was the board meeting on Friday where Melissa would be introduced as Eleanor's heir and Hartford Holdings' new majority shareholder. "How do you want to handle that?" Thomas asked. "We can keep your identity quiet, use proxies and holding companies the way Eleanor did? Or you can step into a public role as the company's owner. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages. Melissa thought about it, remembering Eleanor's letter and her warning about being a target once her wealth became public knowledge. But she also thought about all the years she'd spent trying to be invisible, trying not to take up too much space or draw too much attention. Maybe it was time for a different approach. "I want to learn more before I decide," she said finally. "Can we maintain Eleanor's privacy strategy for now, at least until I understand the business well enough to make an informed choice?" "Absolutely," Thomas said. "Eleanor maintained complete privacy for 60 years. A few more months won't make any difference." By the time Melissa left Patterson's office at 8 o'clock that night, her head was swimming with information, and her heart was strangely light despite everything that had happened with Jake. Thomas had given her his personal cell phone number and told her to call anytime, day or night, if she had questions or needed guidance. Patterson had loaded her down with folders full of documents to review and had scheduled daily meetings for the next week to continue her education. Melissa drove back to her apartment in a daze, hardly believing that this morning she'd been a woman getting divorced by a husband who thought she was worthless, and tonight she was the heir to a billion-dollar empire. When she unlocked her door, the divorce papers were still on the counter where Jake had left them. She picked them up and read through them more carefully this time, seeing things she'd missed in her initial distress. Jake was asking for nothing, which had seemed generous at the time, but now looked more like confidence. He didn't think Melissa had anything worth fighting for. The apartment was rented. Her car was worthless. She had no savings he knew about, no assets, no prospects. He was walking away clean because he thought he'd upgraded to someone better, someone who could actually offer him the life he felt he deserved. Melissa sat on the couch and pulled out her phone. She had dozens of missed calls and texts from her mother who'd heard about the divorce from Jake's mother. There were also 3 texts from Victoria, each one dripping with fake sympathy. Victoria's first text, "Oh my God, babe, I just heard. Are you okay? Call me immediately." Second text, "I can't believe Jake would do this. I know this is hard, but maybe it's for the best. You deserve someone who appreciates you." Third text, "Listen, I know the timing is awful, but I need to tell you something. Jake and we've been seeing each other. I didn't want you to find out from someone else. Please don't hate me, it just happened. You know how these things are. It just happened." The oldest lie in the book, the excuse of people who wanted to pretend they weren't responsible for their own choices. Melissa felt anger rise in her chest, hot and clean, burning away the self-doubt that had plagued her for so long. She typed a response to Victoria's text. "I don't hate you, I just don't want to hear from you again. Lose my number." Then she blocked Victoria's number before she could respond. It felt good, final, like closing a door on a part of her life she didn't need anymore. Her mother could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, Melissa needed to sit with everything she'd learned and figure out who she was going to be now that everything had changed. She pulled out the files Thomas and Robert had given her and started reading about Hartford Holdings' various companies and investments. Eleanor's notes were extensive, years of business insights and strategic thinking documented in her elegant handwriting. In the margins, Eleanor had written personal observations too, little bits of wisdom and advice that felt like having a conversation with her grandmother, even though she was gone. One note, written next to an analysis of a failed investment, particularly struck Melissa. "I invested in this company because the CEO made me feel guilty for doubting him. Lesson learned, guilt is a manipulator's favorite tool. Never invest in someone who makes you feel bad for asking questions." Jake had been a master at that, making Melissa feel guilty for having concerns about his business ideas, for questioning why he never seemed to actually work on his ventures, for wondering where their money went. He'd trained her over the years to stop asking questions, to just trust him and feel bad about her own doubts. But that Melissa was gone. The woman reading Eleanor's notes was beginning to understand that she came from different stock, from a woman who'd built an empire by trusting her own judgment and refusing to let anyone make her feel small. Eleanor had seen that potential in Melissa all along, had watched and waited for her to find it herself. Melissa's phone buzzed with a new text from an unknown number. Her heart skipped, wondering if Victoria had found a way around the block. But when she opened it, she saw it was from Thomas Chen. Just wanted to make sure you got home safely and to remind you that you're not alone in this. Eleanor surrounded herself with good people who believed in her vision. We're all committed to helping you however we can. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll start turning you into the businesswoman Eleanor knew you could be. Melissa smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes again. But this time they were different. Not tears of pain or humiliation, but something else. Something that felt almost like hope. She typed back, "Thank you for everything. I'll see you tomorrow." Before she went to bed, Melissa took one last look at the divorce papers. Then she carefully filed them in a drawer, unsigned. Jake wanted a quick divorce because he was in a hurry to start his new life with Victoria. Well, he could wait. He'd spent years making Melissa wait for everything. Wait for him to get his business off the ground. Wait for him to be ready for the life they talked about. Wait for him to treat her with basic respect. Now it was his turn to wait. And while he waited, while he and Victoria played house and spent money they didn't have on a lifestyle they couldn't afford, Melissa would be learning how to run a billion-dollar empire. She'd be learning from the best minds in business, guided by her grandmother's wisdom and supported by people who'd proven their loyalty over decades. Jake and Victoria thought they'd won. They thought they'd escaped from the burden of ordinary, worthless Melissa to start a glamorous new life together. Let them think that. Let them celebrate. Let them make plans for a future that would never come. Because eventually, inevitably, they would discover what they'd walked away from. And when that moment came, when they realized that the woman they'd discarded and humiliated was actually one of the most powerful people in the state, Melissa wanted to be ready. Not for revenge exactly, but for justice. For the satisfaction of knowing that she'd listened to her grandmother's wisdom and let them reveal exactly who they were when they thought there were no consequences. Eleanor had been right about so many things, but most of all, she'd been right that Melissa was strong enough to handle this. All of it, the betrayal and the inheritance and the transformation that was coming. Melissa fell asleep that night in her small apartment, surrounded by files and documents that represented a future she was only beginning to understand. And for the first time in years, she didn't dream about making herself smaller. She dreamed about becoming exactly as big as she'd always been meant to be. The next morning, Melissa woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment windows and the sound of her phone ringing. She'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, better than she had in months. For a moment, she lay in bed wondering if everything from yesterday had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But then she saw the folders stacked on her kitchen table, the evidence of Eleanor's empire, and knew it had all been real. The phone call was from Patterson's assistant, confirming Melissa's 9 o'clock meeting and letting her know a car would be picking her up at 8:30. Melissa looked at the clock on her nightstand and jumped. It was already 7:45. She'd slept through her alarm for her shift at Lou's Diner, the shift that started at 7. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest, the old instinct to apologize and grovel for being late. Then she remembered. Eleanor had owned Lou's Diner. Melissa technically owned it now. She was effectively her own boss. Though Lou Martin still didn't know that. The irony made her laugh, a sound that surprised her with its bitterness. She called Lou directly, not the diner's main line. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff with early morning irritation. "Melissa, where the hell are you? The breakfast rush is starting, and we're short-staffed." "Lou, I'm sorry, but I need to take some personal time. My grandmother passed away, and there are estate matters I need to handle." There was a pause. Lou's voice softened slightly. "Your grandmother died? I'm sorry to hear that. How much time do you need?" "I'm not sure yet. Maybe a week. I'll let you know." Melissa was improvising with no real idea how long it would take to get a basic understanding of Hartford Holdings. "A week? Melissa, I can't just give you a week off without notice. We've got other employees to think about, schedules to maintain. If you need time off, you file a request in advance. You know the rules." The old Melissa would have apologized profusely and promised to come in as soon as possible. But the new Melissa, the one who'd spent last night reading about her grandmother's business philosophy and strategic thinking, heard the dismissiveness in Lou's voice and felt something shift inside her. "Lou, I understand this is inconvenient, but I'm dealing with a family emergency. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you that I won't be available for at least a week. If that's a problem, you can fire me." She hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding. She'd never talked to an employer like that in her life. But as the adrenaline faded, she didn't feel regret. She felt liberated. What was Lou going to do? Fire her from the diner she technically owned? The absurdity of the situation made her laugh again. Melissa showered and dressed carefully, choosing the best outfit she owned, black pants from Target and a blue blouse her mother had given her for Christmas 2 years ago. In the mirror, she still looked like someone trying to fit in rather than someone who belonged, but that would change. Thomas had mentioned that Eleanor had accounts with various personal shoppers and stylists. Melissa had never needed those things before, but now, as the face of Hartford Holdings, even if that face remained behind the scenes for now, she'd need to look the part. The car that arrived at 8:30 was a sleek black sedan, driven by a professional woman who introduced herself as Margaret Chen, Thomas's wife. That surprise must have shown on Melissa's face because Margaret smiled warmly. "Thomas thought you might appreciate a friendly face this morning, rather than a driver you don't know. I've been wanting to meet Eleanor's granddaughter for years. She spoke so highly of you." Margaret was elegant in a way that seemed effortless, dressed in a cream-colored suit with subtle jewelry. As they drove downtown, she told Melissa stories about Eleanor that felt like gifts, glimpses of a grandmother Melissa had never fully known. I met Eleanor at a charity benefit 15 years ago," Margaret said, navigating traffic with easy confidence. She was dressed simply, nothing ostentatious, but when she spoke, everyone listened. She had this way of seeing right through people's pretenses to who they really were. Later, when Thomas told me she was the Eleanor Hartford, the founder of Hartford Holdings, I couldn't believe it. She seemed so normal, so grounded. "Did you know about me?" Melissa asked. "About Eleanor watching me?" Margaret glanced at her, sympathy in her eyes. "We knew Eleanor had a granddaughter she was grooming as her heir. We knew she was letting you live your own life without interference. But we didn't know the specifics until recently. Thomas is devastated about Victoria's role in all of this. He feels responsible." "He shouldn't," Melissa said, meaning it. "Victoria made her own choices. So did Jake. Still, it must be incredibly painful. Your husband and your best friend." Margaret shook her head. "I can't imagine the betrayal. Yesterday it was the worst thing that ever happened to me," Melissa admitted. "Today I'm not so sure. If Jake hadn't left, if Victoria hadn't shown her true colors, I'd still be living in ignorance. I'd inherit Eleanor's empire while married to someone who only wanted me for my money. At least this way, I know exactly who to trust." Margaret pulled up to the building that housed Patterson and Associates and put the car in park. She turned to Melissa with an expression that was both kind and serious. "Eleanor told me once that every major transition in her life had felt like a death and a birth happening simultaneously. Something old had to die to make room for something new to be born. She said the key was not fighting the process, not trying to hold on to the person you used to be." "Who was I?" Melissa asked, the question surprising her even as she asked it. "Before yesterday, who was I really?" "Someone who hadn't yet learned her own worth," Margaret said gently. "But you're learning it now. And Melissa, when you fully understand what you're capable of, people like Jake and Victoria are going to seem very small and very far away." The education continued in Patterson's conference room, but today Thomas brought additional people. CFO named Richard Sorensen, who'd worked with Eleanor for 20 years. A lawyer named Diana Wu, who specialized in corporate structure, and a woman around Melissa's age named Amelia Porter, who'd been Eleanor's personal assistant for the past 5 years. "Amelia knows more about Eleanor's day-to-day operations than anyone," Thomas explained. "She managed Eleanor's calendar, her correspondence, her personal investments. If you decide you want someone in a similar role, she's expressed interest in continuing to work with you." Amelia was petite and efficient-looking, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses. When she shook Melissa's hand, her grip was firm and professional. "Ms. Hartford, it was an honor working with your grandmother. She was the most brilliant strategic thinker I've ever met. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you transition into your new role." Over the next several hours, the team walked Melissa through Hartford Holdings' organizational structure, which was incredibly complex by design. Eleanor had set up multiple layers of holding companies and trusts, each owning different assets, making it nearly impossible for anyone to trace everything back to a single individual. The genius of it, Diana Wu explained, was that Eleanor could control massive companies while maintaining complete anonymity. Your grandmother served on several boards under assumed names or through proxies, Diana said, showing Melissa a list that made her head spin. She had a voice in every major decision but kept her identity hidden. Some of these companies have no idea that their largest shareholder was a woman who lived in a modest house in Riverside. Richard Sorensen walked Melissa through the financial statements. Billions of dollars moving through accounts and investments with a complexity that would take months to fully understand. But even in this first overview, Melissa could see the pattern of Eleanor's thinking. She invested in companies with strong fundamentals, women-led startups, and industries that serve real needs rather than chasing trends. Your grandmother turned down countless opportunities to invest in social media companies, cryptocurrency, and other tech bubbles, Richard explained. She said she'd lived through enough market crashes to know that sustainable wealth came from building things people actually needed, not from speculation and hype. It was the opposite of everything Jake had wanted to invest in. All his failed business ideas had been based on whatever trend was currently hot, whatever promised quick money and easy success. Eleanor had built her empire slowly and carefully, brick by brick, while Jake had spent years chasing shortcuts that led nowhere. Around noon, Amelia ordered lunch from a restaurant Melissa couldn't afford on a diner salary, and they ate while discussing Eleanor's various properties and assets. That's when Melissa learned something that made her nearly drop her fork. The building where Jake and Victoria just moved into, Amelia said, consulting her notes, the luxury high-rise downtown with the rooftop pool? That's the Morrison Tower. Hartford Holdings owns it. It's one of 17 residential properties in your real estate portfolio. Melissa stared at her. Jake and Victoria moved into a building I own. Technically, you own it through Riverside Property Holdings, which is owned by Hartford Residential Trust, which is controlled by Hartford Holdings, Diana Wu clarified. But yes, ultimately, you're their landlord. The irony was so perfect that Melissa started to laugh. Really laugh, for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Jake and Victoria had run off to start their new life together, and they'd done it in a building owned by the woman they'd left behind. They were going to pay rent to Melissa without even knowing it. Does the building manager know Eleanor was the owner? Melissa asked when she could breathe again. No, Amelia said, smiling slightly. The manager reports to a property management company that answers to the holding company. Eleanor designed it that way deliberately. She believed that buildings should be run professionally without personal bias. If tenants knew who owned the property, they'd try to use that relationship for special treatment. What if, Melissa said slowly, an idea forming, what if I wanted to know more about specific tenants? Would that be possible? Thomas Chen, who'd been quiet through most of the meeting, gave Melissa a knowing look. Are you asking if we can monitor Jake and Victoria without them knowing? I'm asking what tools I have available, Melissa said carefully. Eleanor's letter said I should watch how people act when they think they have nothing to gain from me. Jake and Victoria think they've escaped from ordinary, worthless Melissa. I'd like to see who they really are when they think nobody's watching. Diana Wu frowned slightly. Ms. Hartford, I should advise you that there are legal and ethical boundaries to consider. We can't install surveillance or invade their privacy. I'm not suggesting anything illegal, Melissa said quickly. But if they're living in my building, paying rent with money they may or may not have, that's relevant information I should know about as the property owner, right? If they cause damage or break their lease terms, I should be informed. That's different, Diana agreed. Property managers routinely report issues with tenants to ownership. If Jake and Victoria violate their lease in any way, that information would naturally come to you. Then let's make sure the Morrison Tower manager knows that Hartford Holdings is particularly interested in all tenant activities right now, Melissa said. Not because we're targeting anyone specifically, but because we're reviewing all our properties for potential liability issues. Thomas smiled slightly, a hint of approval in his expression. Eleanor would say you're learning quickly. She believed in understanding situations completely before taking action. She'd say knowledge is power, but only if you're patient enough to gather it properly. The meeting broke for the afternoon, with everyone agreeing to resume the next morning. Thomas offered to drive Melissa home, and she accepted gratefully, exhausted from information overload. On the drive back to her apartment, Thomas asked the question she'd been waiting for. "What are you planning to do about the divorce papers?" "Nothing," Melissa said. "Not yet, anyway. Jake wants a quick divorce because he's in a hurry to marry Victoria. The longer I take to sign, the more frustrated they'll get. And in the meantime, I'm learning everything I need to know about my new life." "And when you're ready?" "When you've learned enough." Melissa watched the city pass by outside the window, thinking about Eleanor's letter and her philosophy about letting people destroy themselves through their own greed and short-sightedness. "I think I'll let them keep thinking they've won for a while. Let them move into their expensive apartment and live the life they think they've earned. Let them spend money they don't have on things they can't afford. And when they've dug themselves deep enough into debt and delusion, when they're completely committed to the story they've told themselves about escaping from boring, worthless Melissa, then you'll show them the truth," Thomas finished. "Not even then," Melissa said, surprising herself with the realization. "I don't need them to know about Hartford Holdings or my inheritance. I just need them to fail on their own terms, to discover that the life they wanted together doesn't actually exist. Victoria has no family money to offer Jake. Jake has no real business skills or prospects. Without someone to support them, they're just two broke, selfish people who deserve each other." Thomas pulled up in front of Melissa's building, the one she now knew she technically owned. Eleanor would approve of that approach. She always said that the best revenge was simply stepping out of the way and letting people face the natural consequences of their choices. "This isn't revenge," Melissa said, opening the car door. "Revenge would mean I still care what happens to them. This is just letting go. Moving on to better things." She spent that evening reading more of Eleanor's notes and beginning to formulate ideas about what she wanted to do with her inheritance. Eleanor had built an empire based on careful investments and strategic thinking, but Melissa was starting to see possibilities Eleanor might not have considered. Technology had changed dramatically in recent years. Social media, content creation, influencer marketing, these were all industries Eleanor had deliberately avoided, calling them unstable and built on vanity. But what if there was a way to invest in content creators more strategically? What if Hartford Holdings could back talented people who were building real brands, providing them with resources and business expertise while taking equity stakes in their success? It was a thought worth exploring, something that could be Melissa's contribution to Eleanor's empire, rather than just maintaining what already existed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Jake's mother called me. She said you're being difficult about the divorce." "What's going on, sweetie? Call me." Melissa hesitated, then decided she couldn't avoid her mother forever. She called, steeling herself for the conversation. "Melissa, finally," her mother answered on the first ring. "I've been worried sick. Jake's mother said you refused to sign the divorce papers. She said you're trying to make things difficult for him and Victoria." "Jake's mother said that?" Melissa felt anger rise in her chest. "Mom, did she mention that Jake left me for Victoria? That my husband and my best friend have been having an affair?" There was a long silence. Then, "She mentioned that Jake and Victoria had grown close, but she said it was because you'd let yourself go and weren't taking care of Jake's needs. She said," "Mom, stop," Melissa interrupted. "I don't care what Jake's mother said. The truth is that Jake and Victoria have been planning this for months. They thought they were trading up, leaving behind ordinary Melissa for something better. And I'm not being difficult about the divorce. I just want to take my time and make sure I'm making the right decisions." "Well, I suppose that's reasonable," her mother said, sounding uncertain. "It's just such a shock. 7 years of marriage and now this. What are you going to do? How are you going to support yourself?" This was the moment when Melissa could tell her mother everything about Eleanor's secret empire and the billion-dollar inheritance. But something held her back. Eleanor's letter had warned her to trust carefully in the beginning, to watch how people treated her when they thought she had nothing. "I'll figure it out, Mom. I always do." "Maybe you could move back home for a while," her mother suggested, "just until you get back on your feet. Your old room is still available." The idea of moving back into her childhood bedroom of admitting defeat and retreating, was almost laughable now. "Thanks, but I'm fine where I am. I need to go, Mom. I'll call you in a few days." After they hung up, Melissa realized with some surprise that she just lied to her mother for the first time in her adult life. Not directly, but by omission, by not revealing the enormous change in her circumstances. It felt strange, but also necessary. Until she understood her new life better, until she knew who she could really trust, it was safer to let people think nothing had changed. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and learning. Thomas and Richard taught her how to read financial statements and understand market trends. Diana Wu explained corporate law and the legal structures that protected Hartford Holdings from liability and maintained Eleanor's privacy. Amelia showed her how Eleanor had managed her time, balancing oversight of a billion-dollar empire with maintaining the appearance of an ordinary retired librarian. "Your grandmother was incredibly disciplined," Amelia explained, showing Melissa Eleanor's meticulously organized files. She worked from 5 to 9 every morning before anyone else was awake, reviewing reports and making decisions. Then she'd spend the rest of her day doing normal grandmother things, gardening, volunteering at the library, having lunch with friends. Nobody suspected she was running a massive business empire from her home office. Melissa began adopting a similar schedule, waking at 5 to read reports and learn about Hartford Holdings' various investments before Thomas and the team arrived for formal meetings. She was learning to speak the language of business, to understand balance sheets and profit margins, to think strategically about market opportunities and risks. On Thursday evening, Amelia arrived at Melissa's apartment with shopping bags from expensive stores Melissa had never entered. "Your grandmother left instructions for this," Amelia explained, unpacking suits and dresses and shoes that looked like they cost more than Melissa's monthly rent. "She said that when you inherited, you'd need appropriate clothing for board meetings and business functions. She had a stylist prepare selections in your size." Melissa stared at the clothes spread across her bed. Beautiful things in fabrics she'd never worn, cuts designed to flatter rather than hide. "She knew my size?" "Eleanor knew everything about you," Amelia said gently. "She'd been preparing for this transition for years. These clothes aren't about changing who you are. They're about giving you the tools to be taken seriously in rooms where people judge by appearances." That night, Melissa tried on the various outfits, seeing herself transform in the mirror. With the right clothes, professional styling, and growing confidence, she looked like someone who belonged in a corner office, someone who could command a boardroom. She looked like Eleanor Hartford's granddaughter. Friday morning arrived, the day of the Hartford Holdings board meeting, where Melissa would be officially introduced as Eleanor's heir. Thomas picked her up at 8:30, and Margaret was with him again, offering quiet support and encouragement. "The board doesn't know anything yet," Thomas explained as they drove downtown to Hartford Holdings' main office. A building Melissa hadn't known existed because Eleanor had kept even the company headquarters anonymous, hiding it among dozens of other businesses in a nondescript tower. "They know Eleanor passed away, but they haven't been told about you yet. Some of them have been asking questions, wondering what happens next. There are members who'd like to use Eleanor's death as an opportunity to push the company in different directions." "What kind of directions?" Melissa asked, nervous about meeting these people who'd worked with Eleanor for years. "More aggressive growth, riskier investments. Taking Hartford Holdings public to raise capital," Thomas said. Eleanor always resisted those approaches. She believed in sustainable growth and maintained control. But there are board members who think we're being too cautious, leaving money on the table. The Hartford Holdings office occupied the entire 30th floor of the tower, but you'd never know it from the building directory. The elevator simply listed it as Johnson & Associates Business Consultants. More misdirection, more layers of privacy protecting Eleanor's creation. Inside, the office was sophisticated but understated, decorated in neutral tones with modern furniture and art that suggested wealth without shouting about it. Melissa's hands were shaking as she followed Thomas down a hallway to a large conference room with windows overlooking the city. 12 people sat around an enormous table, and they all turned to look when Melissa entered. She recognized Richard Sorensen and Diana Wu, the two people she'd been working with all week. The others were strangers, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all watching her with curiosity and varying degrees of skepticism. Thomas guided her to a seat at the head of the table, Eleanor's chair, and suddenly the room felt very quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice formal and serious, "thank you for gathering on short notice. As you know, Eleanor Hartford passed away last week. What you don't know is that before her death, Eleanor made arrangements for succession. She had an heir, someone she'd been preparing for years to take over Hartford Holdings. Let me introduce you to Melissa Hartford, Eleanor's granddaughter, and the new majority shareholder of this company." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Some board members looked shocked, others calculating, a few openly skeptical. An older man at the far end of the table spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Granddaughter? Eleanor never mentioned a granddaughter. And even if this is true, what qualifications does this young woman have to run a company of this magnitude? This is a billion-dollar enterprise, not a hobby." "Ms. Hartford has been in intensive training all week," Thomas said calmly. "And Eleanor's will is absolutely clear. Melissa owns 55% of Hartford Holdings. The rest is divided among various trusts and board members. But Melissa's vote is controlling, and she has final say on all major decisions." Another board member, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, leaned forward. "I'm Carolyn Foster. I worked with Eleanor for 15 years, and I never once heard her mention family." "Forgive my bluntness, Ms. Hartford, but how do we even know you're who you say you are? This could be an elaborate fraud." Diana Wu opened a folder and passed copies of documents around the table. "These are Eleanor's will, notarized and witnessed, her stock certificates, and DNA test results confirming Melissa Hartford's relationship to Eleanor. Everything is legally verified. There is no fraud. Eleanor simply kept her family life separate from her business life." Melissa sat silently, watching the board members react to this information, feeling the weight of their judgment and skepticism. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, that inheriting Eleanor's empire meant inheriting the responsibility of proving herself to people who'd worked in this world for decades while she'd been serving breakfast at a diner. But Eleanor had believed she was ready for this. Melissa had to believe it too. "I understand your concerns," Melissa said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I know I don't have the experience you all have, but my grandmother wouldn't have chosen me as her heir if she didn't believe I could do this. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking for the opportunity to learn, to prove myself, to honor the company Eleanor built." The skeptical older man, who Diana whispered was named Robert Chambers, laughed harshly. "This is absurd. Eleanor built this company through decades of brilliant strategic thinking and careful investment. Now we're supposed to hand it over to someone who probably can't even read a balance sheet? I motion that we restructure the ownership, dilute the controlling shares, and install professional management." "You can't do that," Diana Wu said firmly. "Eleanor's will is ironclad. Melissa's ownership cannot be challenged or diluted without her consent. And as majority shareholder, she can fire any board member who doesn't support the company's direction." That caused another ripple of shock around the table. Melissa saw calculation in several faces, people reconsidering their initial reactions. She thought about Eleanor's notes, her warnings about people wanting to control or use her because of her wealth. This was exactly what Eleanor had predicted. "I'm not here to fire anyone," Melissa said, looking at each board member in turn. "I'm here to learn and to continue Eleanor's legacy. But I also won't be bullied or undermined. My grandmother trusted each of you enough to give you seats on this board. I hope we can work together constructively." Thomas smiled slightly, pride evident in his expression. Eleanor left detailed instructions for Melissa's transition, including mentorship programs and educational resources. She also left assessments of each board member, evaluating who she believed would support her chosen heir and who might cause problems. Those assessments are illuminating. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly wondering what Eleanor had written about them. Robert Chambers looked particularly disturbed, his face reddening. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering Hartford Holdings' current status, various investment opportunities, and the logistics of Melissa's transition into active ownership. Caroline Foster, despite her initial skepticism, gradually warmed to Melissa, asking intelligent questions about Melissa's understanding of the business and offering to help with her education. Others remained coldly professional, making it clear they'd cooperate only as much as legally required. When the meeting finally ended, Melissa felt exhausted, wrung out from hours of scrutiny and assessment. But she'd survived it. She'd sat in Eleanor's chair, faced down a boardroom full of powerful people, and held her ground. Thomas took her to lunch at an exclusive restaurant where everyone seemed to know him, and Melissa began to understand the world Eleanor had inhabited. Quiet wealth, powerful connections, business conducted over expensive meals in private rooms where secrets were currency. "You did well today," Thomas said over wine Melissa couldn't taste because her nerves were still jangling. "Robert Chambers will be a problem. He's been wanting to take Hartford Holdings public for years so he can cash out his shares at maximum value." Eleanor always refused. He saw her death as an opportunity to finally get what he wants. "Can he force that somehow?" Melissa asked. "Not legally, but he can make your life difficult. He has allies on the board, people who agree with his vision for the company. You'll need to be strategic about how you handle him." Melissa thought about that, about Eleanor's advice to let people destroy themselves through their own greed. What if I give him enough rope to hang himself? What if I let him think I might be persuadable? Keep him talking. Let him reveal his full plan. Thomas studied her over his wine glass. That's a very Eleanor Hartford approach. She'd say know your enemy completely before engaging, but it's also dangerous. Robert is smart and manipulative. If he thinks you're weak, he'll try to use that. "Let him try," Melissa said, feeling that new confidence growing stronger. "I've spent my entire marriage with someone who tried to manipulate me. I know what it looks like now. I know what it feels like. I won't fall for it again." They finished lunch and returned to Patterson's office, where Melissa spent the afternoon reviewing more documents and preparing for the week ahead. Amelia brought updates on various properties, including a report from Morrison Tower, the building where Jake and Victoria were now living. "The manager flagged something interesting," Amelia said, pulling up a document on her tablet. "Jake Thornton and Victoria Chen signed a 2-year lease on a penthouse unit last week. Monthly rent is $8,000. They paid first month, last month, and security deposit with a cashier's check that the bank is still verifying funds for." $16,000 plus deposit, Melissa said, doing the math. "Where did they get that kind of money?" "The check was drawn on an account belonging to Victoria Chen's grandfather," Amelia said. "According to our research, the grandfather has advanced Alzheimer's and is in a memory care facility. Victoria has power of attorney." Melissa felt her stomach turn. "She's stealing from her own grandfather?" "We don't know that for certain," Diana Wu cautioned. "She might have legitimate access to those funds, but it's worth monitoring. If Victoria is engaging in elder financial abuse, that's both illegal and something Hartford Holdings would need to know about, given that she's a tenant in our building." "Can we alert Adult Protective Services?" Melissa asked. "We can make an anonymous report expressing concern," Diana said. "They'll investigate and determine if there's abuse occurring. If there is, they'll take appropriate action." Melissa nodded, feeling grim satisfaction. Victoria had spent years pretending to be a good person, a loyal friend, while secretly undermining Melissa's marriage. Now she was potentially stealing from her own grandfather, a sick old man who couldn't defend himself. Every day seemed to reveal new depths to Victoria's selfishness. By the time Melissa returned to her apartment Friday evening, she was running on fumes, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the week. But she'd done it. She'd survived her first board meeting. She'd begun to understand the scope of Eleanor's empire. She'd started building relationships with the people who could help her succeed in this new role. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "We need to talk about the divorce papers. You've had them for a week. This is getting ridiculous." Melissa stared at the message, thinking about Jake living in a penthouse she owned, spending money he didn't have, waiting impatiently for a divorce so he could marry a woman who was potentially stealing from her own family. She typed back, "I told you I need time to think. You'll get my answer when I'm ready." His response came immediately. "This is typical of you, Melissa. You're being petty and vindictive. Victoria was right about you. You've always been jealous and small-minded." The words were designed to hurt, to make her feel guilty for not giving him what he wanted immediately. But Melissa felt nothing except a distant, clinical interest in his manipulation tactics. She'd spent 7 years trying to be less, trying to shrink herself to fit his expectations. Never again. She didn't respond to his text. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle Amelia had brought earlier, something expensive from Eleanor's private collection, and sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jake and Victoria were in their penthouse, probably celebrating what they thought was their victory. Let them celebrate. Let them think they'd won. Because Melissa knew something they didn't. She wasn't just surviving Eleanor's death and her divorce. She was being reborn into someone new, someone powerful, someone who would never again settle for scraps of affection from people who didn't value her. Eleanor's letter had been right. Something old had to die so something new could be born. The old Melissa, the one who'd believed she wasn't enough, was gone. In her place was someone who'd inherited an empire and was learning to wield power with wisdom and strategy. And when Jake and Victoria finally realized what they'd walked away from, when they understood that the woman they dismissed and betrayed was actually one of the wealthiest people in the state, Melissa would be so far beyond them that their regret wouldn't even register. She was done being small, done apologizing for existing, done letting people make her feel less than. She was Eleanor Hartford's granddaughter. She came from women who built empires, and she was just getting started.